In 1983, the video game crash began and there was a nigh universal disdain for anything gaming related. Atari was almost entirely responsible for this, but there simply was no hope in sight for video games as an industry in the United States. In 1986, Sega launched the Master System, which unfortunately did not do enough to really get everyone's attention, as we still got a system that looked like a toy, even if it did thrive in Japan. Not that many people were willing to give gaming another try, at least until Nintendo brought gaming back into people's homes with the NES. Sega's Master System, although capable, was overshadowed almost entirely by the Nintendo Entertainment System. So when the fourth generation of console gaming was rearing its head, Sega made sure to be the first one to jump to market before Nintendo could possibly catch up. In 1989, Sega launched what is widely considered to be the best console that they have ever created. This is the Sega Genesis, and finally, the world can bask in its greatness. The Genesis launched at a time where Nintendo was the dominating force in the industry that was this close to dying in the States, and Sega was its closest competitor, even if it was a very distant second place when you look at the sales numbers for the third generation. The Master System sold between 10 to 13 million units, while the NES sold almost 62 million units, almost 6 times what Sega achieved. The NES was so popular that many referred to different home consoles as a Nintendo because that was the only thing that people expected you to be playing. Their power over the industry at this time was unmatched and completely unheard of. So when Sega launched a console that was set to be much more powerful and to have much better graphics than the NES, that caught the attention of a lot of people. 1989 was the year of the Genesis in North America, and it became an instant success. The Genesis holds some resemblance with the Master System, but Sega did decide to embrace its more 80s gaming aesthetic that they had gone for previously, as the Genesis looks like it fits perfectly within Sega's usual design cues. This was a relatively small system, pretty flat with some soft roundedness to it, which contrasts perfectly with the light gray and boxy VCR look of the NES, which was likely done to set it apart. But it is worth noting that the Genesis retained the same design across regions when Nintendo had launched the VCR-looking Nintendo Entertainment System outside of Japan, but kept the much more playful Famicom within their home region. At this time, it just wasn't necessary anymore to have your system blend in with other tech products, as people are interested in gaming once more. On the top, you will find a volume slider for headphones, the on and off switch, a reset button, the Genesis logo with the 16-bit moniker, and the cartridge slot. On the front, you will find the 3.5mm headphone jack so that you can play your games without disturbing anybody else. A novel idea that unfortunately wasn't widely adapted in the future. But you will also find the 2 controller ports, as the Genesis supports 2-player local multiplayer. On the back, you will find an EXT port, which was used for a modem, but this was a port that was only really used in Japan. Then you will find a switch for switching between channel 3 and channel 4, an RF port, a proprietary AV port, and a power plug. Composite connections have existed since the 1950s, but many people still used RF, as that technology is even more ancient than composite itself, and it took everyone a really long time before transitioning out of that connector. That AV out cable supports composite video, at least on the North American side, but those in Europe had access to a much cleaner connection known as RGB SCART through their own version of the Genesis, the Mega Drive. Unfortunately, here in North America, we were stuck with a noticeably inferior connection, but composite was the best that we had on home consoles for a long time. Then finally, on the bottom, you will find a slot that you can pull out, and that reveals an expansion slot. This did not get any use at first, but it was what allowed the Sega CD to be possible, which was an optional accessory that you could attach in order to play CD-based games later into the 90s. With this new generation of systems, we also get a new cartridge system, and these now hold significantly more storage than the Master System and NES cartridges could hold, upgrading from 512 kilobytes of storage up to 4 megabytes, which was a pretty big improvement, as these cartridges can now accommodate up to 8 times the amount of storage compared to last generation. We even got variations between cartridges, as these smaller ones were the ones that most developers and publishers used, but companies like EA decided to make their own, as they didn't want to pay Sega any licensing fees for using their cartridge design, but besides that, these are virtually identical in their use case and how much data they can store. But this meant that certain publishers were allowed to make custom cartridges for the Genesis as long as they were able to bypass Sega's licensing requirements. As far as I know, EA were the only ones who ended up doing this, and that's why we have taller cartridges with Electronic Arts' name on the back of those carts instead of Sega's. And of course, a very iconic part of the Sega Genesis is its controller. It looks small in pictures, however in person it is quite large. Well, I suppose that the correct word is wide. The D-pad is quite large and there is a great emphasis on its 8 directionality. There are 8 points that the D-pad can point to, but it's really how this D-pad was well designed for 2D related aspects such as fighting games that benefit from the use of diagonals or rolling for combinations. On the Genesis, we get A, B, and C buttons if you received the 3-button variant. These buttons are large and hard to miss when pressing, and the start button on top. Now this layout and design for the controller allows for it to work really well once you've acclimated to it. You simply can't get confused or overwhelmed with such a simple and effective layout and shape, which speaks to the genius of the Genesis controller. Later on, they released a 6-button variant that had some things shifted around and now features a different shape, which was done in order to accommodate those that played fighting games primarily. The Genesis really kept a lot of things into consideration to ensure that everyone's gaming needs were addressed before anyone could even step up to the game. The Genesis launched at $189, but it did come with a game included, and its biggest selling point was that it was much more powerful than the NES, which helped to justify that price. So once we enter the 90s, there were other companies releasing systems such as the CDI, the Neo Geo, among a few others, but those were not the center of attention between the late 80s and 1994. The TurboGrafx-16 was Sega's strongest competitor for some time, but the Genesis was still performing considerably better than it. The Genesis was dominating the 16-bit era for 2 entire years before Nintendo finally answered with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short. When the Super Nintendo released in 1991, the Genesis finally had real competition, and this is when the 4th generation console race really started, as Sega and Nintendo had to release consistently great games to try and sway people from one side to the other. While the SNES had some absolutely amazing games coming down the pipeline, Sega's head start proved to help them in the long run, but the entire life cycle of the Genesis was filled with greatness. These are the games that made it so special. This console promised 16-bit graphics, which allowed for more complex and detailed sprites, world design, more detailed shading, among many more aspects that make 16-bit stand out from 8-bit. And if you know anything about this generation, is that they are ready to implement some 3DS tricks in order to improve the gaming experience. However, unlike the SNES, the Genesis did not have anything hardware related to Nintendo's Mode 7 technology, which was very attractive to many gamers. This meant that if Sega wanted to achieve something similar to this effect that people liked so much, then developers would have to rely on software tricks in order to achieve a similar effect. So for a while, this didn't really matter because after the SNES release, the Genesis was still selling really well. And one important aspect of what really helped to sell the Genesis to American customers was that they eventually lowered the cost of the Genesis and included a much better pack-in game, Sonic the Hedgehog 1. This was no joke, as games like Sonic the Hedgehog got a lot of attention considering that this game was actually very good. This was a momentum-based platformer where you wanted to move as quickly as possible while maintaining high speeds. This game was so successful that it inspired so many games in the Sonic universe, including Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Sonic & Knuckles, among others. But there were so many titles available on the Genesis, a lot of which ended up on both the Genesis and the SNES, but there were still lots of incredible offerings only available on the Genesis. Of course, considering that Mode 7 was a feature that many developers ended up taking advantage of as it looked really good in games such as Super Mario Kart, Sega had to do something eventually to start competing on an even playing field with Nintendo. This is when developers started making similar effects that could not be achieved through specialized hardware and only through software. Games such as Contra Hard Corps showed off what developers could do with the Genesis for achieving a similar effect to Mode 7 with scrolling and even blending the planes in the image to achieve that effect. It wasn't Mode 7, but it still looked really good. Now, some of the best Genesis games of all time include Golden Axe 2, Ristar, Combat Cars, Mortal Kombat 3, Streets of Rage 2, Shinobi 3, Earthworm Jim 2, Toe Jam and Earl, Castlevania Bloodlines, Rocket Knight Adventures, and we of course got lots of NBA games, many more sports titles to speak of, and still so much more. The Genesis was home to so many experiences, and while the SNES was very tough competition for Sega, the Genesis did not really struggle. As many would tell you, this was the generation that really sparked rivalries between people who either sided entirely with Sega and the Genesis or with Nintendo and the SNES. There was no in between for a lot of people. Through the life cycle of the Sega Genesis, Sega modified and added to the Genesis so many times that we ended up with multiple revisions and several ways of experiencing the Sega Genesis. Nintendo, however, didn't care too much to make changes and adjustments to the SNES because their greatest focus was on the games. The Genesis, on the other hand, was a system that somehow adopted so many different forms, becoming one of the most interesting consoles of all time. These are the subsequent models and attachments made for the Genesis. First things first is a reminder of the accessories that we got in order to turn the Genesis into something new. The Sega Power Base converter gives the Genesis full backwards compatibility with Master System cartridges to take advantage of the Master System CPU already baked into the Genesis itself. This meant that you could play Master System games when desired. Then there's the Sega 32X, which was an attachment that allowed gamers to have an affordable entry into the 32-bit era. This essentially meant that there were 3DS games that helped to simulate many of the aspects that we would expect from your usual 32-bit native consoles. Of course, we can't ignore the Sega CD, which allowed you to play CD-based games on the Genesis. This was a big deal because the industry was moving towards a CD-dominated format for physical media that holds up to 700 megabytes of data, which eclipses what a Genesis cartridge can hold. Many people know this, but Sega did re-release the Genesis, and it is often noted as being Model 2, as it is almost identical to the original Genesis, but it removes the ability to support stereo audio. This is also done as a cost-saving measure. And then there are those true hardware revisions, such as the second model of the Genesis, the first true revision released in 1994. This model was made to capitalize off of the success of the original Genesis model, making it much smaller and cheaper. This model loses the headphone jack, stereo audio capabilities, the RF ports, since it is comically out of date, and uses a different port for the AV connection, but it was still compatible with accessories like the Sega CD. Then we got the third edition of the Genesis, known as the Genesis 3, released in 1998, which was much smaller. It is almost identical to the previous model of the Genesis, even if it no longer featured support for accessories such as the Sega CD. This was the least desirable version of the Genesis, as it does lose a lot of that same compatibility that the first three models featured. And finally, there was the Mega PC, which was a tower that happened to have a Genesis or Mega Drive, more accurately, built into the system. You could even switch between two modes, which were Mega Drive mode and PC mode, just depending on what you wanted to do with your computer. This was an awesome idea, but something that simply wasn't replicated too often after this, as PCs have become so much more powerful that they can just run these games whenever natively without the need to split it up into two systems or emulation. Sega really tried their best to experiment and push the Genesis forward so that as many people as possible would dip their toes in there. The Genesis truly was something special. Whenever Nintendo did anything, the Genesis came up with an answer, and vice versa. Games like Donkey Kong Country really went a long way in showing what the SNES was capable of with pre-rendered 3D sprites, and it looked absolutely amazing. But because Nintendo had already future-proofed their system from the ground up with their FX chip, it meant that the SNES was more cost-effective over time. You just needed to buy the system once, and then whatever game cartridges needed that chip. And these chips were embedded onto the cartridges themselves, meaning that the games that needed it came with the FX chip already included. The Genesis required consistent add-ons in order to achieve some of the same things. Natively, the SNES already had 3D support even if it was rudimentary, and was mostly utilized for enhancing 2D 16-bit games, as it was never really capable of displaying 32-bit graphics in any capacity. Sega promised to bring actual 32-bit graphics, which could involve 3D titles with the Sega 32X, which retailed for an additional $159 if you only played cartridge-based games with it, which unfortunately were not the games to really take advantage of the 32-bit format. This meant that if you wanted to make the most out of the same 32X attachment, which featured the virtual processor that allowed for these 3D capabilities, you also had to purchase the Sega CD attachment so that you could play CD-based games and really maximize the 32X's capabilities. This attachment was $299. People could justify that one more easily because they could at least use it as a CD player if they wanted to at home. Either way, Sega's ambitions were definitely admirable, but they cost the consumer a lot of money, especially when Sega ended up disappointing a lot of gamers with their accessories. Back in the 90s, these prices were no joke at all, and very few games were actually made for these accessories. The 32X only received 40 games worldwide, with only 10 of these actually making it in North America. This disappointed a lot of people who purchased these extremely expensive add-ons just to be left without many use cases. The Sega CD at least had other use cases outside of gaming, with it actually selling about 2 million units, but the 32X became a waste of money for most people, selling about 1/4 of that. This is when Sega lost a decent chunk of goodwill that had been built up over the years. On the other hand, Nintendo only kept adding to everything that they had built, with amazing offerings coming towards the end of that generation. But it wasn't really the Genesis that was falling out of favor, but rather Sega, as they shifted focus to a new project while overpromising on a product with a lot of hype and very little support, with the addition of so many cancel titles that instead made it into their next system. This became Sega's primary focus moving forward. The 4th generation console race was as fierce as it could get between two competitors alone, as they removed tons of market share from the rest of the home console gaming industry. The SNES had absolutely incredible titles under its belt, with first-party support that was very difficult to compete with, while the Genesis had many awesome games and constant revisions to remind people of its greatness. But the truth is that this was a really tough competition, and they both had to fight to try and stay on top. But no matter how you slice it, there can only be one at the top. At the end of it all, the SNES took over and ended up becoming the dominant force this generation. The SNES sold 49.1 million units, selling less than the NES over its life cycle. Sega had an infinitely better run this time around, with constant attention being brought to their platform, even if they sold less units at 40 million units total. With how difficult Nintendo has been for competitors to that point, Sega showed the world that they were always capable. The Genesis was one of the most popular home consoles up to that point, and certainly a legendary system to those who experienced it when it was at its best. By the end of it all, Sony had just entered the 5th generation with their PlayStation, which became an instant success. Nintendo wasn't quite ready to jump in, but before anyone could come in to disturb the peace, Sega released their next generation console in 1994 or 1995 in North America. We'll talk about this one very soon, so subscribe so that you don't miss my upcoming mini documentary. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.